Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank our witnesses for being here today. Ms. Melito, in March 2022, the Wage and Hour Division, WHD, published a proposed rule to update the Davis-Bacon and related acts regulations. The proposed rule is more than 100 pages long, contains more than 50 significant changes, and by DOL's own admission is one of the most sweeping overhauls to the Davis-Bacon program in decades. WHD absurdly estimates that its proposed rule will cost businesses $78.97 to comply annually, including 1 hour to read the regulation and 1/2 hour to implement the regulation. Do you think this estimate accurately captures the amount of time and resources necessary for a small business to comply with the sweeping overhaul of the Davis-Bacon regulations? If not, would you agree that DOL has an obligation to assess the cost of compliance accurately for small businesses before issuing a final rule?
Thank you, Chair Foxx, for that question. And I think in response it would be a yes and a yes, but I'll go on a little bit. Absurd is a great way to characterize DOL's regulatory analysis of this, and I've got some numbers here too. The whole NPRM, including the appendixes, was actually 432 pages or 118,450 words. And as you, I think, said, they estimated regulatory familiarization would take 1 hour. I think if you're reading 118,000 plus words would probably take over 8 hours at most. So, and the other thing too with regards to Davis-Bacon is it's going to hit small businesses the most. 82% of all construction firms employ under 10 employees, and construction companies that employ fewer than 100 employees comprise 99% of construction firms in the U.S. I think DOL should withdraw the rule because their analysis was so flawed. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Ms. Gressler, DOL's tipped minimum wage regulation imposes an extremely complicated and cumbersome timekeeping mandate on employers that requires them to track their workers' tasks minute by minute. With such onerous requirements, is it feasible for a small business owner who runs a restaurant to comply with such unreasonable timekeeping requirements?
No, I don't think it's reasonable at all, and I think that the division did not consider the stakeholders who were giving them examples. And for all of us here today, you are members, you run offices, consider what it would be like if each of your staffers had to be classified into the work that they're doing to be direct constituent services supporting, and not related to constituent services, down to every minute that they are doing that. That's impossible for an employer to know what each individual is doing. And so the ways that they will respond will directly hurt workers. And just one of those could be to automate more jobs so that you don't have to deal with tracking actual people.
Well, thank you again. Mr. Wolfson, numerous independent workers have raised concerns that the net effect of DOL's independent contractor proposed rule will be to jeopardize their ability to continue operating their own businesses. In contrast, DOL provides an extremely low estimate of the cost of regulatory compliance and completely fails to provide an analysis of the economic impact of the proposed rule on small businesses. Can you discuss some of the flaws in DOL's economic analysis of the independent contractor proposed rule?
Thank you, Chairwoman Foxx. It's a great question. I think that what's interesting is the Department of Labor tries to have it both ways. They try to say that misclassification is a huge problem, but there's not going to be a lot of change of people's status, so there really won't be a lot of cost. And you can't have it both ways. Either the data that Dr. Sojourner is citing are accurate, and there are millions of workers who are misclassified who, under the new Department of Labor rule, would suddenly either lose their opportunities to work in the job they're working, or would be reclassified as employees, which would have massive costs for the businesses. Whether those workers would keep their jobs becomes a big question. Or most of these workers are properly classified and there's not a big change, in which case there wouldn't be a big cost. But if there wouldn't be a big cost, then why do we need to go through a process of changing the regulation? So I think you're exactly right that the Department of Labor needs to decide either to admit that there are going to be significant costs. They need to look at the data from California with AB 5, where millions of workers were told, tens of thousands of workers were told by companies from all ends of the political spectrum. The New York Times told freelance photographers and writers in California that they were no longer going to work with them unless they left the state of California. That wasn't a bunch of far-right extremists who said, we're not going to work with you. These were people who had very similar ideology to the people in California who were coming up with those rules, saying, we can't work with you because we're not willing to live under those rules. These are the things the Department of Labor should have considered when they put their rule together. Now, the Department of Labor can evaluate this if they decide to try to finalize the rule, but they should have, and they had an obligation to provide this information in the proposed rule. And their failure to do that, as I mentioned in my written testimony, really breaks down the required transparent process that's supposed to exist so everybody can evaluate whether it's a good or a bad proposed rule.
Thank you very much. I yield back.